Good evening and welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us. Before we begin, I would like to direct your attention to the fact that this event is being live captioned. You can access the captions in the menu at the bottom of your screen. My name is Kathryn Vomero Santos. I'm an assistant professor of English and the co-director of the Humanities Collective here at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. We are an interdisciplinary organization that fosters humanistic learning and enables meaningful action through programming that supports the scholarship of humanities faculty and students, engages partners on campus and in the community to advance the public humanities, and calls attention to the relevance and the urgency of the humanities in contemporary society. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow us on social media at HumanitiesTU. I would like to thank my Humanities Collective colleagues, Tim O'Sullivan and Ruben Dupertuis, for their leadership and support. And I would like to extend my deepest thanks to our program assistant, Heather Eichling, and our student worker, Kenneth Leisk, for all of their amazing work on the logistics and promotion for this event. We are also grateful to Jonathan Hill and ITS. Tonight's lecture is part of a series of public events linked to a seminar that I am currently teaching on the topic of Shakespeare and race. In this course, my students and I have been investigating the formation of racial thinking and racialized identities in the period during which Shakespeare lived, and in the afterlives of his plays on page, stage, and screen. The purpose of this event series is to extend these conversations beyond our classroom and into the various publics and communities with whom we interact and intersect. If you are interested in the multifaceted topic of Shakespeare and race, I encourage you to visit the Humanities Collective website for a list of open access and free resources. There you will find articles, podcasts, and videos generated by scholars, teachers, and artists whose work engages these questions from a wide range of perspectives. I would also be delighted to hear from you if you have questions or ideas for collaborations. It is my true honor to introduce tonight's esteemed guest, Dr. Ruben Espinosa, Associate Professor of English at the University of Texas at El Paso. In the decade that I have had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Espinosa, I have watched his scholarship make a powerful field-defining shift, from a first book on the religious and gendered complexities of Shakespeare's England, to a growing body of work on the often fraught intersections between Shakespeare's plays and the racial, linguistic, and transnational complexities of our present moment. From where he stands along the US-Mexico border in El Paso, he has made a loud call for Shakespeare studies to be attentive to past and present issues of immigration, inhospitality, and racism. He has demanded that we not look away as white supremacist violence is repeatedly and systematically enacted on Black and brown bodies. And he has modeled in his publications and in his pedagogy why it is imperative that we think about Shakespeare in boldly cross-historical ways. In addition to being a leading voice in the field of pre-modern critical race studies, Dr. Espinosa is a true leader in his commitment to serving our profession and fostering a more inclusive and just future for Shakespeare studies. Following on the heels of a 4-year term as trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America, he will be moving from his current position at UTEP to become the Associate Director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and Associate Professor of English at Arizona State University. The future is bright indeed. We are gathered here tonight, however, to celebrate Dr. Espinosa's urgently important and eagerly anticipated forthcoming book entitled Shakespeare on the Shades of Racism, which will be published this June as part of the Routledge Spotlight on Shakespeare series, which explores the vital purchase of the modern world on Shakespeare's works. This series is governed by 2 key questions. What can Shakespeare help us see? What can he help us do? In preparation for tonight's event, I asked the editors of the series why they were especially excited about Dr. Espinosa's contribution. Dr. John Garrison responded in this way: "We were so thrilled about this book at every step, hearing about the idea, reading the proposal, and finally having the whole manuscript. We felt so lucky that Ruben shared with us a book that is so magical, deftly combining the personal with the political and tying it all so elegantly to Shakespeare." Dr. Kyle Bibetti added, It is not often that I feel emotionally wrecked when reading a piece of literary criticism. But this book left me a mess. I'm so eager to share it with students, colleagues, and friends. One of the first reviewers said, "Publish this yesterday." And I'm glad that yesterday is here. We are all glad that yesterday is here and that we get the first preview of this work tonight. In a few moments, I will turn things over to Dr. Espinosa, who will read excerpts from the book. Following that, I will ask him a few questions that I have prepared in advance, which will give you plenty of time to put your own questions in the Q&A box. If you feel inspired after tonight's event to pre-order your copy of the book, Routledge has created a special discount code for this event, and I will share that link and code in the chat. Thank you again for sharing your time with us this evening, and I am delighted to turn things over now to Dr. Espinosa.
Okay, so first of all, thank you to the Trinity Humanities Collective, and especially to you, Dr. Vomero Santos, for inviting me and for organizing this event. I am honored to be here and thrilled to interact with your students and the community in San Antonio, and thanks everyone for being here. Sorry, I'm a little blown away by that introduction, and it's probably showing at this point, but I actually have this scripted, so I want to start by recognizing John Garrison and Kyle Pavetti, who invited me to contribute to Routledge's Spotlight on Shakespeare series. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with these two brilliant individuals, and Polly Dodson has supported the vision for this book throughout, so thank you. So before I begin, I just want to recognize that although I've done book talks before, I've never done this. I've never done a straight up reading from a book that I wrote. And while I don't have the physical book in front of me, as it won't be out in print until June, I am reading from my proofs, and the very idea that I might not like what I'm reading and that I won't be able to go back and revise it makes me incredibly uneasy. So if you see a look of consternation on my face, you can understand why. But nonetheless, I'm going to give it a shot. And as Dr. Vomero Santos mentioned, the idea is for me to read 3 relatively short passages and then turn to the conversation. So the first passage I'll read is taken from my 3rd chapter entitled All My Pretty Ones. And it's a chapter that focuses on images of children in Shakespeare and our contemporary society, children who are forced to contend with oppressive structures and various forms of tyranny. And so I'll be focusing on a passage that looks at Macbeth here. So bear with me while I navigate some of this. Okay. So when Macbeth offers a glimpse of a lighthearted exchange between Lady Macduff and her young son, whom she endearingly calls poor monkey and poor prattler, we witness something surprisingly tender during an otherwise frightening depiction of that world. The exchange doesn't overtly provoke our pity, but rather offers an amusing repartee to demonstrate quite subtly the trust and bond this mother and son share. They are both witty and playful and seemingly positive despite the tyrannous backdrop of the play. But it is also a scene that contains within it both a mother's love for and the murder of that child. The willingness to murder children illustrates the extent to which Macbeth will go to maintain power and secure his legacy. There is no bottom to that cruelty. One could easily argue that this is exactly how white supremacy works in its own investments in power and legacy. The incarceration of brown children coming to the US-Mexico border is monstrous, but what is equally horrific is that such unnecessary tactics are meant to exhibit and sustain the perception of white supremacy because the lives of these brown children are imagined as expendable. It is not merely a message to say to them, you don't belong here, but to say to all of us dark of skin, we can and will do this to you and to yours. And what can Shakespeare teach us about this cruelty? Nothing. He can teach us absolutely nothing about this. We don't need Shakespeare to recognize that cruelty. He doesn't contain some universal truth to shine a spotlight on that horror. But what we can perhaps recognize is that there is an opportunity to understand that when I, brown of skin and disheartened that my people are kept in camps just miles from my hometown, bring particular experiences to the table when engaging with and putting the spotlight on Shakespeare, his works means something very different. That difference, I think, is critical to behold and to treat with seriousness whenever we consider how scholars and readers who are Black, indigenous, and people of color come at Shakespeare. What we make of Shakespeare stands to cast a light on the shades of racism that surround us. Where I locate poignancy in Macbeth when considering how Black and brown children in our world are devalued is in Macduff's response to the news of the murder of his wife and children. It is as heartbreaking a moment as you'll find in all of Shakespeare's oeuvre. Ross enters and interrupts the conversation between Macduff and Malcolm, and the latter asks, "What's the newest grief?" Ross, understandably apprehensive to reveal to Macduff that his family has been murdered, stalls in revealing that particular news. When pressed, he finally says, "Your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered. To relate the manner were on the quarry of these murdered deer to add the death of you." Macduff struggles to speak, but ultimately asks, "My children too?" Clearly, he is in disbelief, but he needs to know. The conversation continues. Ross, wife, children, servants, all that could be found. Macduff, "And I must be from thence. My wife killed too?" Ross, "I have said." Malcolm, "Be comforted. Let's make us medicines of our great revenge to cure this deadly grief." Macduff, "He has no children." "All, my pretty ones?" "Did you say all?" "Oh, Hellkite, all? What, all my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop?" Malcolm, "Dispute it like a man." Macduff, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man." Urged to enact revenge on Macbeth for killing his wife and children, Macduff instead pauses to recognize and feel the weight of this loss. "All my pretty ones?" he asks. What we as an audience are asked to apprehend here is not only the loss that this father feels, but also the violent world that does not cease. Malcolm immediately sees revenge as a cure to Macduff's grief. He prods Macduff to act on that grief, to dispute it as a man should. Macduff's rejoinder, "But I must also feel it as a man," echoes loudly the play's attention to the absence of humanity in the world of Macbeth. As a human, Macduff needs to feel this pain, and he is clearly asking others to empathize with him. When he asks then, "All my pretty ones," they are not his alone. These children are the responsibility of all of us. We must all feel that loss. We must all feel that pain. And thereafter, as Macduff does, we must all act on it. When the terrorist Patrick Crusius, whom I discussed in the previous chapter, traveled across Texas from Dallas to El Paso, he drove past the town of Clint. The particular migrant children's detention center featured on the PBS NewsHour segment that I discussed above is located in Clint, a town that is a mere 30-minute drive from El Paso. When the Walmart massacre was over, an outpouring of both local and national support and sympathy quickly washed over the El Paso community. The national media descended on El Paso, and the sorrow of the city was on the nightly news. People were angry, sad, shaken, and overall quick to offer whatever support they could to the families of the victims. The slogan, "El Paso Strong," was adopted citywide. The local community came together, and the broader US community looked on in seeming solidarity. Still, 30 minutes away, kids were in cages, and whatever anger anyone was feeling about that situation was muted. The media connected the terrorist act with the incendiary remarks of Trump and later to Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who before the shooting had called on Texas to defend the border. But directly after the massacre, Abbott traveled to El Paso, was welcomed into a church that my mother attended the better part of her life, and prayed alongside our community, most of whom are of Mexican descent. I found Abbott's presence in my hometown revolting, as his policies are aligned with those of Trump. Indeed, when Trump enacted the so-called Muslim ban, Abbott forcefully supported this policy and made it clear that Texas would not accept any Syrian refugees. Clearly, the man knows nothing about the way US immigration law works, but I digress. What Abbott was obviously trying to do is to signal to the constituents who voted him into office that he believed Texas should remain majority white. It was no different than him calling for Texans to defend the border. Understandably, the story was that Crusius was influenced by the political tone from the top that harnessed hatred toward Latinxes. But before Crusius shot one single bullet, brown kids in camps were already dying, and our government was responsible. Still, those children remain within detention centers in Texas. Who will say of these brown children, all my pretty ones? After all, isn't this our collective responsibility? Okay, so the second passage that I'll read is taken from my chapter 4, titled Ain't I a Woman, which focuses squarely not only on racism Black women endure, but the racism that white women enact. The passage I'll read begins with attention to a character from Othello, Barbary, Desdemona's mother's maid, or more accurately, her slave. Barbary, of course, is also the focal point of Toni Morrison's brilliant play, Desdemona. But in this excerpt, I arrive at Janet Sears' play, Harlem Duet, and I would be remiss here not to give a shout out to Netta Medizadeh for her excellent article on this play, Othello in Harlem. So read her when you get the chance. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, this is a tricky part. I'm not having the physical book in front of me. Okay, here we go. Okay. The deployment of the conveniently dead and silent Barbary to highlight Desdemona's suffering not only privileges whiteness, but altogether undermines the absent character. Barbary's sadness matters only because it registers Desdemona's sadness and is not in and of itself important. Barbary is not in and of herself important. This is the brilliance of Toni Morrison restoring a voice of resistance and giving Barbary a name. So often, as Imtiaz Habib's vital work has shown, Black people in Shakespeare's England were nameless and invisible. But this, for me, is also what is so hard-hitting about these cross-historical perspectives, as erasure and silencing of Black women persist to our present moment. We need to listen and to recognize that the diminishment of their value through systems of white supremacy, explicit and implicit in our current time, is quite often a matter of life and death. Most of us, I hope, are aware of the disparities in healthcare when it comes to Black versus white women. The statistics for pregnancy-related deaths for Black women are particularly sobering. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Black, American Indian, and Alaska Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. As the CDC notes, most pregnancy-related deaths are preventable. Racial and ethnic disparities in pregnancy-related deaths have persisted over time. The persistence of these disparities is telling. If these deaths are preventable, why are they not being prevented? Health professionals have this information, and yet clearly there is no investment in widespread reform to address these disparities. This is an epidemic, and yet little attention is being paid, likely because Black and Indigenous women are seen as expendable, even within a system that is meant to save lives. In an article that thoroughly outlines the various factors at work in healthcare disparities across the board for Black women, Erica Stallings is unafraid to consider the role of racial bias in medical care. Stallings asks us to consider that the mortality rate for babies born to Black women with a doctorate or professional degree is higher than the rate for babies born to white women who never finished high school. A picture begins to emerge of forces at once bigger, deeper, and more insidious at play. The role of racism, Stallings tells us, is a major factor in diminished health and healthcare for Black women. And although medical studies prove this, little has been done to change the system. As long as racism persists, disparities will follow. Stallings writes, that's the reality of being a Black woman dealing with this country's healthcare system. Too often we have to go an extra mile, many extra miles, just to ensure we get the baseline level of treatment to which everyone is entitled. And all the while we have to ask ourselves, was I mistreated because of my race? Many healthcare workers might answer, of course not, to that question, but so often bias is clearly in place, and Stallings demonstrates this with medical study after medical study, as well as anecdote after anecdote. To be a Black woman in this nation often means to be ignored, silenced, and put in a state of precariousness because of the color of your skin. As Stallings says, just as a house continually battered by storms will eventually list, sag, and crumble, the health of Black people in America is corroded by the relentless assaults of racism. This is indeed the insidious nature of a society that sometimes looks at racism, denounces it, and yet does absolutely nothing to change structures of white supremacy, because so long as the structures continue to privilege whiteness, for so many, there is little to care about beyond that. This is why we should not be surprised that so many white women voted for Trump. But what so many of these white women need to recognize is that the devaluement and disregard for Black lives does not improve the situation for white women, and of more importance, reforms that address racial inequities will not result in less for white women. Such reforms would simply serve as a corrective so that every single patient gets the adequate healthcare they deserve. For many, even that is too big of an ask. The weight of this for Black women is, I think, why we need to interrogate the striking disparities when it comes to womanhood and white supremacy. In her breathtaking play, Harlem Duet, Janet Sears thoughtfully interrogates such disparities by appropriating Shakespeare's Othello to consider the effects of racism on a Black woman. Set in 3 different periods, the US South in 1860s, Harlem in 1928, and the present day, Harlem Duet imagines Othello in love with Billy, a Black woman, prior to and during his relationship with Desdemona. Near the end of the first act, Billy contemplates the tragic history of those who have come in contact with the famed handkerchief as a way to articulate the tragic history of so many Black people in this nation. Ultimately, she considers the privileged racism of white women. And this is directly from the play. While Susan Smith, she blamed some imaginary Black man for the murder of her 2 boys, and that's why authorities didn't suspect her for nearly 2 weeks, stopping every Black man with a burgundy sedan from Union, South Carolina, to the oranges of New Jersey. And you're still wondering what made her do it? What was she going through to make her feel that this was her only way out? Yet all be discarded as some kind of unconscionable, bitter shadow or something. Ain't I a woman? This is my face you take for night, the biggest shadow in the world. For Billy, the understanding that even the most monstrous of white women like Susan Smith are afforded serves to overshadow and diminish her worth, her very presence in this world, because the truth is that Black women are not afforded the same understanding. Okay, and the final passage I'll read tonight is taken from chapter 6, which is entitled The Dangers of Indifference. So one thing I struggled with in writing this book was to harness the particular energies of critical race theory that encourage us to draw on the personal. And here you'll find some of that. I'll read from the chapter's opening first before arriving at my own experiences and a kind of personal take on this. When the First Lord tells Duke Senior and other courtiers the story of Jaquez's melancholic reaction to a murdered stag in As You Like It, the humorous tale takes a serious turn once the language of citizenship is employed. As a careless herd full of the pasture passes a dying stag, Jaquez is said to remark, "Sweep on, you fat and greasy citizens. 'Tis just a fashion. Wherefore do you look upon that poor and broken bankrupt there?" Because the story comes on the heels of Duke Senior suggesting that he and his men go and kill us venison, attention to Jaquez's empathy for the dying animal provides a counterpoint that ought to ring comedic. But the personification of the careless herd carries with it some biting commentary on the indifference that greedy citizens, both in the court and in the country, exhibit. As the Lord goes on to say of Jaquez's criticism, "Thus most invectively he pierceth through the body of country, city, court, yea, and of this our life, swearing that we are mere usurpers, tyrants, and what's worse, to fright the animals and to kill them up in their assigned and native dwelling place." You must recall, Duke Senior is a man who sought refuge in the forest, who sees these men as his brothers in exile, and who finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Their new pastoral environment, the liminal space that they inhabit, has something to teach them, but respect for this environment seems to have its limits. Much too often, it is easy to ignore the suffering of others, and these men are being asked to consider precisely that. More importantly, they are being asked to consider their own roles in the exploitations of those they are displacing. We can recognize in the act of indifference to the suffering stag that Jaques condemns our own tendencies to dismiss such suffering when it comes to the long, brutal history of colonialism and colonized peoples. In the settler colony that is the United States, the greed and tyranny that led to widespread genocide and slavery are defining facets of the fabric of this nation. The continued indifference to the suffering of indigenous peoples and Black Americans too is a defining facet of the fabric of this nation. The history of inhumanity and the inhumanity of our historical present are only possible because of such indifference. This chapter considers how, as a nation with a deep history of racism and abuses of human rights that has nonetheless fashioned itself as a land of exceptionalism, we often ignore in our historical present the violated Black and brown people residing not only in our country, but also in regions beyond. Whether it be the femicides in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, the killing of unarmed Palestinian protesters at the Gaza border, Haitian displacement, human rights violations in Darfur, or government-sanctioned murders in the Philippines, acts of terror and tyranny in the not-so-distant past are often met with apathy. Those human rights abuses feel far off, and yet we need to recognize that they are not unlike the ongoing human rights violations in our own nation. Of more importance, we need to be vividly aware that our government has time and time again exhibited indifference to suffering when it comes to Black and brown people, both here and elsewhere. This chapter draws on Shakespeare not only to explore the relevance of the danger of that indifference in our current moment, but also to put under the spotlight the repulsive political bodies that capitalize on the suffering of those who are Black and brown. And here I'll skip forward just a bit. The unwelcome sign went up a long time ago in the United States, and there only seems to be heartache for immigrants arriving on our proverbial shores. In these immigration courts, children as young as 3 years of age are being asked to represent themselves. The idea for these immigration judges is clear. Their voices and the circumstances that led them here do not matter, so we should deport every single one of them. If it is death they face on the other side of things, and so be it. However, we know that it does not have to be this way. The psychological, emotional, and physical pain that our government inflicts on these immigrants is unconscionable, and yet the camps, the torture, the facade of an impartial judge, and the grotesque architects of these policies persist. What are we doing about it? After 2017, I was traveling quite a bit for conference presentations and guest lectures, and I began to notice more often than not groups of brown children escorted through our airports in El Paso, Texas. I did not want to admit to myself that they were likely victims of family separations being relocated. It was jarring at first, and the frequency of it is what was truly repulsive. At every turn, I wanted to ask those adults escorting them what they were doing. I wanted to tell them that all of this was wrong. I wanted to ask the children, usually dressed in white t-shirts, navy blue khaki pants with knockoff Vans, slip-ons, if they were okay. I feared always that I would make things worse for them. What power did I have? What force could I use? In my arsenal, I had only a knowledge of Shakespeare and a heavy heart. I convinced myself that I was powerless. I regret much too often not telling those agents in plain clothes that they were disgusting, to look them in the eye so that they could see I understood fully their monstrosity. I once saw Beto O'Rourke at the El Paso International Airport shortly after I saw a group of such kids, and I went up to him. He was running for Senate at the time, to tell him that Texas needed him and that I hoped he wouldn't seat the bigot Ted Cruz. I felt awful for the kids I had just seen. I distinctly remember the kids holding transparent gallon-sized storage bags filled with what looked like snacks and supplies. I wondered how long this would hold them over. I wondered where they were headed and what and who they were leaving behind, possibly forever. I thought about the mundane act of pulling out such a Ziploc bag from its box in my kitchen cabinet, filling it with some leftover food or other, and not worrying about wanting. What terror did those kids feel in that moment as they held that bag in their hands? In that moment, I sought someone who held the power to enact change in the policies that were hurting so very badly my own people, which is why I approached Beto to tell him this. I'm not even remotely close to a fanboy when it comes to politicians. Talented poets and musicians are another story. I did not mean to posit Beto as a white savior, but that is precisely what I did. I thought he could remedy the situation if he won, which was misguided, I know, because the system is so much larger than any single person. But I wanted someone, I didn't care who, so very badly to save those kids. Voicing my support to him didn't make me feel better, but I had hope things might change. Ultimately, Beto lost, and also 545 children lost their parents. Sexual, psychological, and physical abuse permeated those camps. I delivered my talks. I went about my ways. We have not closed the camps. We have not abolished ICE. I still long for the day we will. When we are made to feel that we are kept situated in spaces of silence, inaction, and seeming patience, then we can recognize the dangers of indifference at work. In those various moments when I walked through the El Paso International Airport, I should have been able to look at any other person in that very airport to ask, are you seeing this? This is not right. We need to do something. But I know that not everyone shares my disbelief. I know that not everyone cared where those kids were going or what their situation was about. In fact, some likely agreed with the policies being enforced. Most looked at those kids, tried not to make eye contact, and then kept moving. Was I then part of that careless herd? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. As promised, I'm sharing in the chat the link to pre-order the book. And I'd like to invite everyone in the audience at this time, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll take as many as we can. But in the meantime, I've prepared a few questions for Dr. Espinosa to kick off our discussion. And I think my first question is related in many ways to what you just read. So as I mentioned at the outset of tonight's event, the Spotlight on Shakespeare series is governed by two key questions. What can Shakespeare help us see? What can he help us do? What are you hoping that you have helped your readers to see? How do you hope that, and these are your words, looking at Shakespeare with the darker shades of racism of our present moment in mind might translate to action or social change?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So to the first question, I mean, I guess, you know, my hope is that there would be an understanding, a general understanding, right, that the lived experiences of so many are vastly different here, and especially when it comes to Black and Brown individuals, and that, you know, attending to those experiences and to what transpires here, right, might shift the valence, I think, of the meaning of Shakespeare in a radically different way here, right? I think much too often he is imagined, as I mentioned, you know, as kind of having this universal truth and something to offer us here, right? But I think conversely, you know, we really need to consider what voices are not necessarily given the platform here, right? And how, when we tend to these issues, it can change its meaning, from my perspective, in a better way. And I think that dovetails with your second question. I mean, I feel like Shakespeare shouldn't be an escape, and I know people often feel like it should. I think we need to make better use of it and better use of his works, and really think about him not as an escape, but as an entry point to meaningful discussions that our students need to be having, and quite frankly, that our colleagues need to be having.
Absolutely. So another identifying feature of the series, as we could hear in your reading, is that while the books are indeed scholarly and based in academic research, they're written in a lucid voice and largely free from hyper-specialized jargon and the cumbersome footnoting to which we are also accustomed to seeing in academic writing. So I'm wondering if you could reflect on some of the challenges and the opportunities afforded by writing a book like this in this particular historical moment.
Yeah, so I mean, the challenges are manifold. I think I'm not, you know, I'm not used to writing in this way. I think it opened things up, to be certain here, right? And I felt like, okay, if I can really embrace the idea that this is more manifesto, right, than a book of literary criticism, then then I could go forward. And ultimately, I think I did. I mean, I think I let go. My apprehensions are in place. I mean, I do feel already, those of us who are working on critical race studies of Shakespeare, we have a clear recognition that in many in the academy, see this type of work, as undisciplined is a word that is often deployed here, right? So even when the works are heavily footnoted, right, when the research is meticulous, there is this perception, that these scholars are undisciplined, and usually the card of anachronism is evoked. But so my fear is that some are not going to read what the Spotlight on Shakespeare series is intended to do and come at this book thinking it's passing for traditional scholarly work. With that said, though, I also think, in my essay, Stranger Shakespeare, I talk about I think the value of hearing student voices that are unfiltered through a critical apparatus. And that is something I felt that I could do here. I could let go of that quite a bit, right? And not feel like I'm entering into this critical conversation about this play, but rather let me reflect on issues that are important to me here, right? And how those issues can change the meaning of Shakespeare.
Thank you. So the last question that I have for you before I turn things over to our audience is a question about your larger body of work in your career. So how would you situate this book within your larger body of work in your career path as a scholar, teacher, and now future associate director of the field defining center that is the ACMRS? How has this book helped you to look both backward and forward in your development as a Shakespearean in the 21st century? What are your hopes for the future of Shakespeare studies after writing this book?
Uh, that's a loaded question, especially the latter part. I think, yeah, for sure, it's allowed me to look backward and to think about, what really was for me, Shakespeare and Immigration felt like that was a book where I came, out of editing it, and you have a brilliant essay in that collection, but I think the group that was compiled for that collection was a wonderful, wonderful community. And it allowed me to think about, what is possible. And, Peter Erickson, who just delivered, I think, a fantastic talk at the Shakespeare Association of America and reflecting on his own experiences, in his essay for that collection also, his very succinct view that sometimes we need to leave Shakespeare behind resonated with me. And I think, moving forward, this is a moment for me where I feel like I can finally, engage in work that is meaningful with and feel comfortable in my skin. Quite frankly, I think that has been in place. As I've worked on this. You mentioned before that the moment, right? And I have to say, and I mentioned this in an afterword to the book, because while I was writing this book, the pandemic hit. It stalled things, but then also the lynching of George Floyd transpired, right? And after he was murdered, right, the world shifted, and I had to really consider that. I don't discuss it. I kept the book that I envisioned up to that point in place and include an afterward to discuss it. But for me, it feels all the more necessary. And it's unfortunate, in reading this book and seeing what I discussed and anticipating, like, things can get worse, right? And we need to do this. And I think the insurrection of January 6th showed a lot of that. And so hopefully, it will resonate with some readers in that vein. But I think I'm excited, quite frankly, moving forward, and to be joining an incredible institution like ASU, and certainly, the ACMRS. I feel fully fortunate in terms of what's possible there, and so excited to be working with Diana Thompson, of course, but the many others involved in that center, and the programming, right, that's going to bring in so many wonderful scholars.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, from where I'm sitting, this book feels like such a culmination of work that you've been doing and an occasion piece for the moment. And I think it really represents the way that you've allowed so many of us in the field to speak out and to do this work in really meaningful ways. So I know we're all really excited to read the rest of the book. So we have a few questions from our audience. The first one is from Kim F. Hall, who says, "Thanks so much for this brilliant book. I'm wondering if you might have more to say about Shakespeare himself as a, quote, white savior in the popular white mind. Thinking here about the use of him in the 1990s culture wars and even the attention to teaching Shakespeare in prisons, but at times it seems everywhere."
Yeah, that's a great question, and the short answer is yes. I mean, I attend to that in this book, and definitely, you know, I've looked at the way that certain individuals, you know, Steve Bannon is one who's kind of high profile individual, Boris Johnson as well, you know, in the UK, who draw on Shakespeare, right, for their xenophobic and certainly, you know, to justify, right, English-only initiatives, for example, here, right, and always code for, you know, valuing whiteness above everything else. And so, I mean, this is an ongoing issue here, right? And I think when, you know, the conversations about what was happening in medieval studies, right, and the co-opting of medieval literature by white supremacists, right, was really kind of blown open here, right? Many, Kim Hall included, I think, you know, really luminaries in our field, Ayanna Thompson as well, you know, kind of came forward and recognize that they're going to come after us, right? That this is like we are next, right? This is our field, and we have to be ready for that. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like that's anticipating that is critical. But absolutely, I mean, I think what was exciting about this is thinking about, you know, the toppling of monuments last summer here, right? And Shakespeare is a monument to whiteness that needs to be toppled. And so this is my little nudge in that direction as well.
Thank you. So I have a question from one of my students who is off to medical school in the fall, and she and I were actually talking about medical racism just yesterday. So I'd like to read her question. She says, "As you mentioned in your lecture, although there are efforts to denounce racial prejudices and biases, not much is done to actually address the structures of racial inequity that exist in institutions like our healthcare system. Educational institutions like medical school, high school, college, etc., seem like places where changes can start to be made to recognize and address these structures of racial inequality. However, do you see other areas or places where we can enact such changes and become more actively involved in dismantling structures of racial inequality? And is reimagining the way we approach and interact with Shakespeare one way to enact such change?"
Oh, so wow, that's a great question, and I think, I mean, so the short answer to Shakespeare is yes. I think it's a way into it here, right, and to a way into these conversations. And I think if we begin, you know, with the circles, academic circles that we know, right, we can then begin to move outward, I think, to institutional practices. So, you know, beginning with even the way that we engage Shakespeare will allow us to also think about the way we engage with our scholarly organizations, right, which will allow us to think about the way we engage with the academy at large, and our own, you know, whatever institutions that those might be. I think efforts can absolutely be made, and I think it is important to support and to ask institutions to support. And if you are not, you know, a BIPOC scholar, I think there's much that you can do to ask your institutions to support and foster environments where these conversations can actually take place. I was fortunate enough uh, to be invited to be a mentor for one initiative out of Duke University, where they paired mentors with early career scholars here, right? And all of them were scholars of color, as a means of allowing those early career scholars to have mentors outside of their institutions, where they could vent, where they could discuss microaggressions, where they could discuss what happens. But what stood out to me in the conversations that weekend were how many of those scholars who've been in the field for a long time, many of them in administrative positions at this point, right, talked about, you know, the effects of just years of racism on their health, and the recognition that, you know, years of their own lives have likely been lost because of having to endure that. I think those aren't narratives that are expressed often enough, and I think our white colleagues need to know this, and not, you know, not just we can't be speaking, I think, about this in a vacuum. I think there needs to be opportunities for them to recognize that this is a case statistically proven here, right? What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I think that that's so important. I mean, one really concrete example that I can think about is student evaluations that repeatedly the studies have shown that they are biased, that they are racist, that they discriminate on the basis of gender and sex, and yet they're still used as tools by which we are promoted and by which we are compensated, right? And I think on top of that, the racism and homophobia that people endure in these evaluations, just reading these official documents, is something that people need to know about, and that people shouldn't have to be dealing with silently.
Right, right.
So we have a question from Umbrine Databoy, who says, thank you for sharing, for starting with the critical point that Shakespeare has nothing to say to some of the atrocities that BIPOC face under systemic racism. That said, what does Shakespeare's cultural capital allow us to do to speak to these issues?
I mean, yeah, that it gives us a platform, like just plainly stated. I think it gives me a platform. It gives me an audience semester after semester of students who have to take my class here, right? This speaks to both, on the one hand, the racism. I mean, just kind of straight up racism that surrounds the Shakespeare, monument that I discuss here, right? I mean, in most universities, often a Shakespeare class for English majors is required, and often he is the only sole author class that students have to take here, right, are required to take. And so as such, it perpetuates a view of his greatness, would-be universality, et cetera here, right? But I think if people are attuned to what they can do and how they can engage with Shakespeare, right, to use him as a vehicle to create these conversations where we can talk about the racism in his works and in our present moment, right, then we should capitalize on that opportunity. And I will point to Harry McCarthy has a recent essay out on white allyship that I think is worth reading, and really allowing especially our white colleagues, right, to think about ways that they can engage with his works and create those conversations and be honestly just candid about the racism within our academy as well, right? So that's, I think, where he can be used. But also I think many have appropriated and used Shakespeare in very interesting ways. I pointed to one of them with Janet Sears, right? I think we need to be engaging with works, right, that tell the story, right, that needs to be told, that Shakespeare can't tell.
Right. Yeah. Bernadette Andrea has a question that is related to that, and is about your students and the kinds of questions that your students ask as appropriators themselves of Shakespeare. So she writes, thank you so much for these glimpses into your important and eloquent book, Ruben. I'm wondering, how has your responsiveness to the larger questions your students are asking help you envision this book? How are their innovative projects in your Shakespeare classes inspiring new ways to think about impactful modes of scholarship? What are they teaching you and us about how to rethink our modes of writing?
Yeah, I mean, I am, and I mentioned in this book, I'm indebted to my students for allowing me to re-envision and rethink what purchase Shakespeare has in our day. I think that wasn't, I can't pretend that I walked into the classroom and that I knew, right? I think that being challenged over time, and certainly, I really kind of just shudder at what I was doing early on in teaching Shakespeare here, right? And going in and saying he was born in, 1564 in Stratford, and talking about the man, and, recognizing very quickly that's not the approach if I want to arrive at, I think, important conversation. So to get to that question though, I think, I'll just offer an anecdote. I think one learning moment for me was, I was discussing Ayanna Thompson's essay on Shakespeare Quarterly on YouTube Shakespeare here, right? Mooring the Moor. And it was it's a wonderful essay, a wonderful opportunities for students to see different perspectives on Shakespeare, right? Student-centered perspectives. And in one of the videos that Ayanna Thompson discusses, right, students did not want to don blackface, understandably, right, but instead they cut out images of Lawrence Fishburne here, right, to kind of hold in front of their face when they were playing Othello, and in some ways, right, perpetuating that view. And so when we were having this conversation, one of my students came to their defense, right, and said, but like, what else would they know? That's your fault. And I was like, what? It's my fault. Like, what are you talking about? She said, I mean, you are, she's like, not necessarily yours, but this is what we're being given, right? As professors, like we are being shown the Lawrence Fishburne, version of Othello. Like we don't get anything else. And that was a moment for me where I thought, I want to see what else there is. I will say this student, long before I returned to Valeria Lucelli, which I have you to thank for actually, Katie, right, for bringing her to my attention. The student had engaged with that piece on Shakespeare, New Mexico for a project she did. And so it really allowed me to see the archive in different ways. And that was my invitation to them, like, think about Shakespeare in a broader way. Where do you see him in popular culture, right? Where do you find him in music? Where do you find him in film? Where do you find him in whatever it is, right? Magazines, stationery, etc., right? And what kind of meaning can you bring to that? How do you engage with that? And that has afforded me an array of glimpses into his possibilities. And that's why I feel like the book I should have been writing, right, which I'm very glad that I finished this book, right, but I was working on it concurrently with Shakespeare on the Border, and I have John and Kyle to blame. They said this could be like a side project, right? You can be writing while you're working on another project, and it consumed me. But as I return to Shakespeare on the Border, I'm excited to start engaging with much of what my students have shown me.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I do have a question that's sort of related to writing and this series in particular. You talked about your writing process, and you just talked about how it kind of temporarily took you away from a project and is bringing you back to that project with new energy. So do you have any advice for other scholars about doing this kind of writing, and maybe putting it into conversation with some of the more like public facing writing that you've done, as a way of clarifying what it is that you're doing in a more traditional scholarly monograph?
Um, so the short answer is no. I don't even want to offer advice. This was the most unhealthy enterprise I undertook, and I think because of the pandemic, right? And what my writing process was like during the pandemic was horrific. I really, I was writing, in the middle of the night, because that's the only time that I had with young children, right? And no childcare, and everything just kind of weighing on this. But in terms of public facing work, I mean, I think the advice that I would give is read it. There's a lot out there. There are great contributions. Katie, I know you've got great pieces out there, and there are a lot of people who are doing public facing work. I think letting go of the apprehensions that I discussed before here, right? Thinking about the audience in a broader way. And I guess this goes back to Bernadette's question as well here, right? How I want to make Shakespeare accessible to my students as well here, right? And not perpetuate some view of elitist, views of his work here, right? And prop him up as somebody we should revere, right? But rather somebody we can engage with and get dirty with in some ways here, right? I think that's what public facing work is as well here, right? Is just being candid, and that's easier said than done. That's why I don't feel I can offer advice, because I can't pretend that I'm not apprehensive to this day, right? Whenever I put something out, I think like, oh, like, how is this going to be received, right? And what is going to be said about it? And I scarce believe that I'm going to let go of those apprehensions anytime soon. But I think, I'll give advice that I don't take. I think that one needs to let one's guard down.
I think all writers give that kind of advice. They give the kind of advice that they should accept themselves. And I think it's also reassuring, as a fellow writer and scholar, to know that somebody that I really admire also feels apprehensive, and to know that that is actually, in fact, part of the process. And so thank you for sharing that. I think that lots of people in the audience will be pleased to hear it, but also will affirm that it's not true in your case when they read the book. Well, if there are no further questions, I would just like to remind everyone that you can pre-order your copy of Shakespeare on the Shades of Racism by visiting Routledge's website and using the code FLR40 at checkout. We're really, really excited for this book to come out in June. Thank you, Ruben, for sharing some really powerful pieces of that project and for talking so openly about your process. It's been a real joy to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you, Katie, and thank everybody who came out tonight. I know it's hard to be on Zoom these days. So I really appreciate it. But thank you mostly, Katie, for organizing this invitation.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening, everybody. Bye-bye.